You know, we often hear these grand narratives about history, but the reality is usually much more complicated and sometimes deeply disturbing.
Hmm.
Today, we're diving into one of those darker chapters, the Mau Mau Uprising in Kenya. This happened between 1952 and 1960.
Right.
And this wasn't just some small rebellion. It was, well, a full-blown war of resistance that saw incredible brutality, mass detentions, and some truly shocking violations of human rights.
Yeah, what's fascinating here and, deeply troubling is how this period really forces us to confront the violence inherent in colonial power.
Exactly.
The usual story of the British Empire often focuses on um, progress and order. The Mau Mau Uprising throws a very, very harsh light on the methods used to maintain that order.
It really does, and that's precisely what we want to explore with you today. Who were the Mau Mau? Were they freedom fighters struggling for their homeland and, fundamental rights?
Or were they the terrorists depicted by British propaganda at the time? That's the key question.
Right. And crucially, how did Britain react to their uprising? We're going to dig deep into the details, using excerpts from a document called The Mau Mau Uprising, Britain's Brutal Crackdown in Kenya as our guide.
Okay.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with the conditions that led to this conflict. Where do we begin?
Well, to really understand the uprising, you absolutely need to look at the roots of British control in Kenya. While 1920 is the official date it became a colony, British influence had been growing for decades before that.
Okay.
And what's critical to understand is the systematic way land was taken from the indigenous population. That's really the core issue here.
Right. The document makes it very clear European settlers essentially took vast amounts of land for themselves, forcing native communities off their ancestral territory.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about, land ownership. There was a really strict and unfair system of racial segregation put in
Yeah, I
place.
saw that. The White Hilers.
Absolutely. The creation of what were known as the White Highlands is a perfect and frankly grim example. This incredibly fertile land was reserved exclusively for European settlers.
While native Kenyans were often left with much smaller, less productive areas.
Exactly. Or frequently ended up working as laborers on the very land they'd been displaced from.
Hmm.
It was deeply unjust.
And it went beyond just where people could live and work, didn't it?
Oh, yes. Native Kenyans were denied basic political rights.
Yeah.
They had virtually no say in how their own country was governed.
Plus, really severe taxation policies were implemented, which put an enormous strain on the native population.
Yeah.
You can just see how this constant pressure and injustice would eventually, boil over into organized resistance.
Precisely. Decades of these kinds of injustices created, a breeding ground for opposition.
Yeah.
Which brings us to a central point.
Mm.
Who exactly were the Mau Mau?
Right, because as you mentioned, the term itself was largely a creation of the British, wasn't it? A label they applied to the rebels.
That's right. And for you listening, it's important to understand that Mau Mau wasn't a name the rebels necessarily chose for themselves. It was a term largely applied to them by the British colonial administration, often with negative connotations.
And it's important to remember that this secret movement really started to gain momentum among the Kikuyu people, specifically in the 1940s.
Mhm.
They were the largest ethnic group in Kenya, and they were experiencing the harsh realities of colonial rule most acutely, particularly around land.
And what's fascinating here is the initial focus of the movement. It wasn't like immediately about violence from the start.
No.
Their core demands were actually about land reform and fundamental political rights, very basic grievances that stemmed directly from the way the colony was being run, things they felt were being completely ignored.
The document also mentions these oath-taking ceremonies. That sounds like a pretty significant element of how the movement operated, sort of binding people together.
Absolutely. These oaths were crucial. They were a way to solidify commitment and loyalty to their goals. It was a powerful cultural and spiritual element that helped to unite people within the movement, often under intense secrecy.
Right.
Over time, though, as their demands continued to be ignored and the pressure from the colonial authorities intensified, this grassroots movement evolved. It ultimately turned to armed resistance.
So you see this progression from political organizing, trying to work within the system, to eventually picking up arms.
Exactly.
And it's striking how differently they were perceived. Britain, through its extensive propaganda machine, painted them as these savage terrorists.
Right. Bloodthirsty savages was common terminology.
While for many Kenyans, they were seen as genuine heroes, risking everything in the struggle for their freedom. That's a massive difference in perspective.
It really underscores the power of narrative, especially during times of conflict. Understanding those two completely opposing viewpoints is essential for grasping the full complexity of the uprising.
Yeah.
And, as we've discussed, the reasons behind this uprising were deeply embedded in the long, long history of colonial rule.
No question. The document really emphasizes how decades of colonial injustice provided the fuel, the tinder for this explosion of resistance.
As it really did.
And when you look at the specifics, the issue of land dispossession consistently emerges as the most critical factor, right?
Absolutely central. It's almost unbelievable when you look at the scale. By 1950, we're talking about over 1 million Kikuyu people who had been forcibly removed from their ancestral lands.
1 million people. That's huge.
It's not just a bureaucratic policy. It represents a massive disruption of people's lives, their communities, their culture, their ability to sustain themselves.
And beyond the immediate loss, this systematic seizure of the most fertile land destroyed traditional agricultural practices.
And forced many into exploitative labor arrangements, often on the very land they once owned. This economic vulnerability was a key driver of resentment, no doubt about it.
And the fact that white settlers received preferential treatment in pretty much every aspect of British policy just added, well, insult to injury, didn't it?
Completely. You had this widespread poverty and lack of opportunity for native Kenyans existing right alongside this privileged, relatively small white minority. It's a textbook example of a situation ripe for conflict.
Definitely.
And that deep resentment, as we've discussed, ultimately led significant numbers of Kikuyu, but also people from the Embu and Meru communities, to take up arms. They turned to guerrilla warfare.
Operating from the forests, attacking colonial targets.
Exactly. They launched attacks against colonial targets, collaborators, and those associated with the colonial administration.
It's important to note, though, as the document highlights, that the Mau Mau wasn't a completely unified entity. There were internal divisions, even within the Kikuyu community itself.
That's a crucial point.
Which sadly led to a really complex and brutal internal conflict alongside the fight against the British. It wasn't a simple, straightforward battle of us versus them.
No, not at all. That internal dynamic is often overlooked in simplified accounts, but it's absolutely crucial for understanding the full tragedy of this period. These divisions weren't simply about different factions. They often stemmed from varying levels of participation in the colonial system, differing views on strategy.
And even manipulation by the colonial authorities, right? Trying to weaken the movement.
Yes, seeking to weaken the movement from within. This internal conflict added another really tragic layer to the period. Now let's turn our attention to Britain's response, which was characterized by, well, to put it mildly, extreme force.
Overwhelming force is the term the document uses, and it really doesn't seem like an exaggeration. In 1952, a state of emergency was declared, and Britain deployed a massive military presence, around 55,000 troops, to try and crush this rebellion.
And it wasn't just about boots on the ground. The establishment of this extensive network of detention camps is a particularly dark chapter.
Yeah, the camps.
The sheer scale and the documented brutality within these camps are genuinely shocking.
Absolutely. The forced relocation of over 1.5 million Kikuyu into these so-called protected villages. It's just staggering.
1.5 million.
The document even describes them as essentially concentration camps.
And the conditions inside were absolutely horrific: widespread disease, starvation, rampant physical and psychological abuse. It's almost impossible to fully grasp the sheer scale of human suffering involved.
It's unimaginable.
The details that have emerged over time, particularly about the conditions in places like Colonial, paint a truly grim picture. We're talking about systematic torture, executions without proper trial, and the deliberate deprivation of food and water for detainees.
And it wasn't just like isolated incidents carried out by a few bad apples, was it?
No, that's the key point. The later revelations, especially from uncovered documents, point to a systematic policy. We're talking beatings, electric shocks, horrific sexual violence being used by British forces and their local allies.
To extract confessions and break the will of the detainees.
Precisely. It speaks to a level of institutionalized brutality that is deeply disturbing and really challenges any notion of a benign colonial administration simply maintaining order. Britain's counterinsurgency tactics were implemented with extreme prejudice.
Yeah, counterinsurgency, the strategies used to suppress rebellion, mixing military force, politics, propaganda.
Exactly. And this raises a really important question about how such widespread abuses could have occurred and been sustained over such a long period.
How did they get away with it, essentially?
Well, unfortunately, a significant part of the answer lies in the role of media and the incredibly powerful tool of propaganda.
Right. During the peak of the uprising, British propaganda went into overdrive, didn't it? Consistently portraying the Mau Mau as these bloodthirsty, irrational terrorists.
Dehumanizing them, effectively, in the eyes of the British public and the world.
And this demonization wasn't just about justifying the violence already happening.
No, it also served to undermine any potential sympathy or support for the Mau Mau movement, both domestically in Britain and internationally. It framed it as a battle against, barbarism, rather than a legitimate fight for self-determination.
The document highlights how newsreels and newspapers back in Britain consistently depicted them as primitive savages engaged in barbaric rituals.
While simultaneously downplaying or completely ignoring the abuses being committed by the colonial authorities and security forces, it created this very one-sided narrative.
A narrative used to justify the government's incredibly harsh response in the eyes of their own population.
Absolutely. But thankfully, that carefully constructed narrative didn't go unchallenged forever.
No, eventually the truth started to leak out.
Yes, international journalists and human rights activists eventually began to uncover and expose the brutal reality of Britain's counterinsurgency tactics and the horrific conditions within the detention camps.
And the Hola massacre in 1959, that seems like a real turning point.
A huge turning point. 11 unarmed detainees were brutally beaten to death by prison guards. Impossible to cover up.
And that sparked widespread public outrage, didn't it? Both within Britain and internationally.
It really did. It forced the government to begin reconsidering its policies and approach. It significantly damaged that carefully crafted image of a just and benevolent colonial power.
Absolutely. It was a stark and undeniable example of the extreme brutality that had been going on, and it became very difficult for the British government to just ignore the growing criticism. Now, let's take a moment to talk about some of the key individuals who were involved in this intense conflict on both sides. Understanding the human cost and the broader historical forces, it's also important to consider the individuals who really shaped these events.
Sure. Jomo Kenyatta is probably the most widely recognized figure in the story of Kenyan nationalism.
Right, often seen as the face of the independence movement.
Exactly. While he was often labeled by the British as the leader and mastermind behind the Mau Mau,
the evidence directly linking him to the planning and execution of the armed uprising was actually quite limited, wasn't it? According to the document.
Currently quite limited, yes. Nevertheless, he was arrested and imprisoned by the British for allegedly supporting the movement, which ironically boosted his profile even further.
And then you have Dedan Kimathi. He sounds like a very different figure.
Very different. He emerged as the fierce and highly effective military leader of the Mau Mau forces operating in the forests. He really personified the armed resistance against colonial rule.
A field commander.
Absolutely. Kimathi's capture in 1956 and his subsequent execution in 1957 were significant blows for the Mau Mau militarily.
But
in many ways, it also cemented his status as a martyr and a powerful symbol of resistance in the eyes of many Kenyans fighting for independence. He's still revered today.
Okay. And on the British side, the document mentions Governor Evelyn Baring.
Yes, Governor Baring, and also General George Erskine, who is the key military leader overseeing the crackdown.
And their policies, the methods they employed, still highly controversial, I imagine.
Oh, absolutely. Their decisions and actions during this tumultuous period are certainly subject to intense historical scrutiny, particularly when we consider the later revelations about the widespread abuses and the, ethical implications of their counterinsurgency strategies.
Which naturally leads us to consider the eventual aftermath of this brutal conflict. How did it all end?
Well, by the late 1950s, as the document indicates, the British government began to recognize that this war was becoming politically and economically unsustainable.
Too costly.
Exactly. The costs, both in terms of finances and, perhaps more importantly, the damage to Britain's international reputation, especially after events like Hola, were simply becoming too high to bear. The political will was eroding.
And so in 1963, Kenya finally achieved its long-fought-for independence.
Yes, a major turning point. And ironically, Jomo Kenyatta, despite his earlier imprisonment by the British for alleged Mau links, became its first prime minister, later president.
It's a powerful illustration of how even the most brutal suppression can ultimately fail to extinguish the desire for self-determination, isn't it?
It really is. But the story doesn't simply end with Independence Day celebrations.
No, because decades later, the survivors of the horrific Mau Mau atrocities began the difficult and often frustrating process of seeking justice.
A long, hard fight for recognition and compensation for the immense suffering they had endured. Many had been silenced for decades.
And the British government's official apology in 2013, that must have been a huge moment.
A really significant, albeit incredibly belated moment. They finally acknowledged the systematic torture and other forms of abuse that had been committed by the colonial administration and security forces during the emergency period.
An admission of systematic torture, that's quite something from a government.
It is. And along with that formal apology came a financial settlement, $19.9 million in compensation offered to the surviving victims.
Okay. But, as the document points out, many felt that this compensation was insufficient, right? Given the scale of the suffering and that it came so late.
Exactly. For many survivors, it was too little, too late. And it raises profound questions about the very nature of historical accountability. Can financial reparations ever truly address the deep and lasting wounds, physical and psychological, inflicted by such widespread and systematic human rights abuses?
A difficult question with no easy answer.
Definitely not. And the legacy of the Mau Mau Uprising continues to be a subject of intense debate and discussion even today.
Absolutely. The long-standing denials by British officials regarding the true extent of the atrocities for so many years only compounded the pain and suffering felt by the survivors and their families.
It really did. It wasn't until well into the 21st century, largely thanks to legal action by survivors and work by historians, that thousands of previously classified and, frankly, hidden historical records began to be uncovered.
The migrated archives?
Those infamous migrated archives, yes. They finally started revealing the true scale and the systematic nature of what had actually occurred during the emergency.
And even now, despite the overwhelming historical evidence that has come to light,
You still encounter these very different and often conflicting perspectives, don't you? Some still argue that Britain's actions, however brutal they may appear in hindsight, were ultimately necessary to maintain law and order in what they perceive as a volatile and dangerous colonial situation.
the defending civilization against savagery argument.
That kind of argument, yes. While others, and I think the weight of historical evidence increasingly supports this view, see it as a clear and undeniable case of colonial war crimes that demands full recognition and accountability.
It really forces you to confront the uncomfortable and often brutal realities of imperial power, doesn't it? And the extreme methods that were frequently employed to maintain that power.
Absolutely. So as we bring this deep dive to a close, it's clear that the Mau Mau Uprising is far more than just a forgotten footnote in the history books.
Definitely not just a footnote.
Indeed. It stands as a stark and incredibly important reminder of the immense human cost of colonial rule. It vividly illustrates the extreme lengths to which empires will often go to suppress any form of resistance.
And, equally importantly, the remarkable resilience and unwavering determination of those who dare to fight for their own freedom and self-determination against overwhelming odds.
Precisely. And the profound legacies of this colonial violence continue to be felt in Kenya and, frankly, in many other parts of the post-colonial world today.
Affecting issues of land ownership, political dynamics, and the often contested collective historical memory, right? How people remember and teach this history.
Absolutely. The battle over memory is ongoing, which raises a really crucial final thought for you, our listeners, to consider. Reflecting on our discussion today, what are the ongoing debates surrounding historical accountability, not just for Kenya, but in the broader context of colonialism across the globe? And what are the long-term responsibilities, if any, that former colonial powers have in addressing the enduring consequences of their actions in various regions? It's a complex and vitally important conversation that continues to evolve.
And one that we all need to engage with critically, thinking about the past to understand the present.
Exactly. Something to really mull over